This, our signature public event of the Scientist in Residence program. My name is Dr. Candice Bedell, and I am Assistant Professor of Chemistry and Physics here at CMU. This year, we have the honor of hosting Dr. Martin Entz from the Faculty of Agriculture at the University of Manitoba. Typically, the Scientist in Residence event is held over the course of 1 week, but we have had the privilege of having Martin on campus all year, as he chose to spend his sabbatical year with us, during which many of us have enjoyed exchanging ideas with him. But in addition to the regular informal engagement the CMU community has had with him so far, the past few days has also included formal lectures by Martin, a chapel, lunches with students, and group discussions with faculty, all of which have been very well received and much appreciated. One very memorable and inspiring line we heard from Martin this week was, "What I look for in a potential student is that they have a desire to change the world." Martin works in the field of cropping systems and natural systems agriculture and is passionate about working with farmers and learning from their experiences. He has spent the last 25 years leading the Glen Lee study, which is Canada's oldest organic versus conventional farming systems experiment. His interest in ecologically integrated farming system research and development work has taken him around the world, from Central America to Northwest China. Martin and his family also enjoy their shared family farm called Shady Maple Lane, a place where they not only grow and rest, but build community. Martin is passionate about land, and as you may or may not be aware, we meet here tonight on Treaty 1 territory. As we do so, we seek to honor what it means to gather on Treaty 1 land as covenanted between Anishinaabe, Cree, Dakota, and European settler peoples in 1871. And before I turn the stage over to Martin, I would also like to acknowledge the interest and support of Richard Penner from Calgary in inspiring the Scientist in Residence initiative, along with other initiatives and conversations that bring together science and faith. Now I will turn it over to Martin, who will speak to us about the science of Sabbath, meeting the expectations of the land.
Okay, thank you very much, Candice. It's so nice to see so many people here and so many people that I know. A special shout out to my parents who made it. We'll be celebrating my dad's 90th birthday in a month, and so I'm so pleased that he's here. I think this telepathically, Candice, advanced for you, so I'm going to go take it back to the beginning. Okay, thanks. It's been a great week, meeting with students, faculty, talking about a whole range of issues, and meeting Richard, who supports this event. Richard and I share an interest in agriculture. I learned a lot about the vegetable seed business in California and all over the Middle East, and we had a wonderful afternoon yesterday. So thank you for that time. Here we have, you recognize the place? Yeah. So many say the environmental crisis is growing faster than anyone had expected. We can think about that. I think about it in the same way as I think of the Titanic. The Titanic, as we sometimes play fast and loose with the Earth, the owners of this ship certainly played fast and loose with the passengers on this ship. And you may remember that as this ship was entering the ice pack, the owners decided to light the fourth engine, to speed it up even more so that they could enter the New York harbor and surprise everyone. That's a problem. And it is a tendency of ours as human beings to always want to go faster. Scientists have raised alarm bells about this for a long time. This is Rachel Carson's on the bottom right. Rachel Carson's, you'll remember, wrote Silent Spring in 1962, published Silent Spring. And she was actually an ocean scientist, and even back in the 1950s had observed the pH of the oceans changing and was ringing the alarm bells on climate change. So scientists have always been part of the conversation. it's usually irritating to have scientists around because they go, yeah, but, and politicians go, well, it's not so bad. We'll just keep doing exactly what we've been doing. But what we're hearing from scientists really is to slow the Titanic down, is to slow down our consumption so that we have time to figure out how we're going to cope with 10 billion people on the planet and still keep a livable planet. I'm so happy you're here because this is a serious issue and it requires serious people. And so as I heard, scientific colleagues and going to conferences and, we're always talking about not becoming Luddites, but just slowing down, thinking about what we're doing, what type of technology we want to introduce. I couldn't help but thinking about the whole concept of Sabbath. I thought, well, we've kind of exhausted our conversation as natural scientists and even social scientists. What would Scripture say about this? And so for many years now, I've been really interested in the idea of Sabbath rest. So what you're going to hear tonight is a sort of poorly constructed, half-baked set of ideas. The science part is easy. It's bringing the science together with the concept of Sabbath that for me has been the struggle, but I'm happy to share it with you. I would like to thank those who helped me with this, both in my home department, my colleagues and my staff, some of who are here, my graduate students, one of whom is here, and I'm taking notes to see who else is here. But all the problems with my presentation are my responsibility. Okay, so that's who I am. I call my research group the Natural Systems Agriculture Laboratory. We have some laboratories, but we also work outside in nature a lot. We put, I don't know how many tens of thousands of kilometers on our vehicles every summer. I had some really good university professors, but after I graduated from university, I had a lot of good mentors. I certainly had my family, my parents, my grandparents, my siblings, my aunts and uncles. They were all great mentors, and these are some special mentors that have meant a lot to me, from people who've long since passed away but have written interesting books, to people who are still alive today who I've had a chance to work with. I just want to highlight two of them. Ellen Davis is somebody that I first heard here at CMU, and in fact, that's probably why I even, have decided to have this relationship with the Canadian Mennonite University. Is I was struggling with how to sort of frame creation care and stewardship, and then I heard Ellen Davis's lectures here, and it was really terrific. And actually, my daughter and I visited the Land Institute and heard her again a couple of years ago. In her agrarian reading of the Bible, she concludes that the human role is to meet the expectations of the land. I love that term, because the land is more than just soil, it's the land community. And we are not only stewards, we are not just about creation care, we are also servants. The second person who really influenced my thinking was Wes Jackson. This is somebody that I did meet while I was a university student. He came to the University of Saskatchewan to present his very different ideas on perennial polyculture. And he got a pretty rough ride from the faculty when he was there, but he could take it. And he likes to say, if you're working on a problem that you can solve in your lifetime, you're not thinking big enough. And that, we can't all be working on problems that we can't solve in our lifetime, but being at a university where I have the privilege of time and some resources, it's important to consider the big picture. So the other thing that Wes talks a lot about is this dualism between, sort of the spirit and the here and now world. And I'll let the theologians take over that discussion. But he frames it as sort of a little bit of a tension between nature's wisdom and human cleverness, as he calls it. Wes is very interesting use of words. And I have to say that many agricultural research ideas sort of are over on that end of that spectrum. It's about cleverness. It's about, we can design something to fix this problem. It's a lot of, I hate to say it, a lot of downstream thinking. We're going to fix problems as they arise. What we've tried to do what I've tried to do with the help of wonderful colleagues and staff is to really look at nature as the measure. And all we're doing is borrowing from West Jackson. But we're putting it in the context of our Canadian prairie region, and I think we're having a lot of fun. So we call ourselves the Natural Systems Agriculture Lab, and I certainly feel as a steward and also as a servant. Okay, so that's a little bit of introduction. The next part of any good seminar is, okay, what's the problem? So we're going to do a diagnosis, and a diagnosis of what's happening and what are the challenges. Well, as people always will come to realize, is that the population is growing, and one of the questions is, can we feed ourselves? Can we feed the world? We don't know if we're going to have 10 billion in this century or 9 billion. I think the data is pretty clear that we can feed ourselves. The earth is very productive. But just because we can does not mean we will. And we just have to look at some of the communities in Syria right now that where there's food around them, but it doesn't get to them. And one of the major reasons for hungry people on the planet is conflict and displacement through conflict. But biophysically, yes, we can feed everybody, but we're going to have to give and take, and we're going to have to stop our conflict. Second, I've got 7 points here. That's the biblical number of completion, right? So that was coincidence. The second sort of checkup point is, are we powerful? We are entirely powerful. Photosynthesis, which is the process by which carbon is fixed out of the atmosphere and brought into plants and made into sugars and then made into fats. And, the green part of plants is chlorophyll, which helps that process. 40% of global photosynthesis is procured by humans, mostly for food. So we are powerful. We are a major force on the planet. We command a lot of that. And we need photosynthesis for other things as well. So we can't really have it all. I remember being a student, and Ed Halstead was a soil science professor, and we were so excited about increasing wheat yields and increasing the harvest index. And Ed said, you have to leave something for the soil, Martin, because some of that sugar, sort of makes its way into the soil. I said, yeah, you're right. The third thing is that we're sloppy. This is a satellite image of an island, Madagascar, off of the African coast. And you can see the red here. I don't know if it shows up with the lights, but the red is soil washing into the Indian Ocean. This is something that is played out all over the world. It has for some time. We are currently losing soil at about twice the rate that new soil is being formed biologically. That is, of course, unsustainable. So that is a reality, and we'll be talking quite a bit about soil. But when it comes to land, earth, it's not just, how much is on the land and how much is eroded. It's also about who gets it. And I had the opportunity to work in Honduras on a project, and I traveled there quite a bit a few years ago. And every time I would land in La Ceiba, I would be struck by how the flatland was used for the export crops, for pineapple and for coffee and for palm oil. And the locals had to produce their food on the hill slope. That's I guess a land justice issue that we need to confront. Number 4, water. I could have talked a little bit about aquifers and the challenges of irrigation agriculture in China and US and India, where aquifers are dropping, and we have to improve our irrigation efficiency. There's a lot of work that needs to be done there. But I wanted tonight to refer to the oceans, because when we look at food production, most of our food comes from the terrestrial system, but some of it does come from the fishery. And if we kill the fishery, that's just going to put more pressure on land. The red dots are dead zones, and the yellow dots are zones that are threatened to be dead. Dead zone is an area where there's so many nutrients running into the water that the organisms use the oxygen, and then there's no oxygen and the fish die. The largest dead zone in the world is in the Baltic Sea. The second largest is in the Gulf of Mexico, and on the bottom right you can see the Gulf where the Mississippi River enters the Gulf of Mexico. There's a very, very large dead zone. So when you fly for a southern holiday, you fly over a dead zone. This is very challenging because we know the value of water. Just think about Flint, Michigan. Number 5, this is a complex slide. What I really want to illustrate here is the biodiversity part. We need to maintain the diversity on our planet so that it functions. We've always had this tension between how much pesticide, which means herbicides and fungicides and insecticides, we can use before we're actually doing some damage. And that's a bit of a moving target. Sometimes you can use some, sometimes you use different types. There's not really a clear answer here, but we're tending to use too much. And I showing a picture of Tyrone Hayes here, and if you're interested in this issue, write down that name and Google it. And there's a very interesting story in how he's found that frogs are affected by various herbicides used in corn production. And so this is an issue. Number 6. Here's a very startling fact. This is very dark. The light's going to come. But one of the issues is that we have a lot of urbanization, and by the UN, Habitat predicts that by 2030, 2/5 of all people are going to be living in urban slums. That's not in urban areas, that's urban slums. Where are those people coming from? If we look at India, many African countries, some Central American, Southeast Asian countries, they're smallholder farmers. There are 500 million smallholder farmers in the world. That's 500 million. And the economic and social and sort of political infrastructure in developing countries is really not set up to favor them. I think it would be fair to say if they want to leave the land, but they should leave it by choice, not be forced off of the land, which is really what's happening now. It's very difficult for smallholders to make money when there is actually quite a bit of money in food. So that's the 6th issue. And the 7th issue, and the final one, and then we'll start talking a little bit about Sabbath, is really the carbon issue. Carbon is really the element that runs the planet. It's our energy source for our bodies. And we have a dual challenge here. The first one is that the conversion of fossil fuel energy to food is not very efficient. And the second one is every time we burn energy, we add carbon to the atmosphere, which affects our climate. I'm not going to go through the numbers here, but I'm just going to warm you up to the idea that if we sequester carbon in soil, that really does buy us quite a bit of time in terms of retooling our whole energy system, which of course we have to do. So if the earth is your child and your child comes home from school and your child brings you the report card, you could say, "Child, how did you do in school?" Okay, so this is the report card. Past performance, consistently productive, creative, current performance, showing signs of stress, relations, getting along with other kids and stuff, cooperative, tries to play well with others, is taken for granted. What needs to improve? Needs more rest, more thoughtful work habits. Yeah, you know where I'm going with this, right? But I like to, the analogy with athletes is one that I like to use with my students. And here's Dirk Nowitzki, one of my favorite basketball players. The other two are my children. In whatever 2000 and whenever, the Dallas Mavericks didn't win the NBA championships. Dirk he was working too hard. He was too nervous. He was not resting well. He was not working well. And so they didn't win the championship. And, once he had better rest and more thoughtful work habits, they did win the championship. So, okay, next section. I was walking through Assiniboine Park one day. This is a real story, and I saw this monument, and I went to look at it. I thought, well, it had some sort of Union Jack type things. I thought, well, it'll be some kind of a British Empire congratulatory monument. Much to my surprise, it was the 10 Commandments, and this is my way of segueing into the idea of Sabbath as a way of dealing with those very challenging problems, which I just illustrated. So I tried to learn more about Sabbath. What does it actually mean? Is it just about resting? And what I learned very quickly, thanks to all of you who helped me, is that it's not only about rest, it's also about how we work. And I heard many stories. People said, I tried resting, it didn't work for me. I just want to work differently. And I totally understand that. So it's much more complicated than just resting. So the Sabbath principles deal with rest and work. And so let's talk about rest first of all. There's three things that I've picked to sort of frame my discussion here. Sabbath, when we rest, helps us to co-celebrate creation. It tells us that we're not in charge, and it also gives other people a chance. I thought that was really interesting. So this is what I got from the theologians here. And let me just illustrate that with a few examples. If, co-celebrating creation or creative work, I think of biodiversity. I think of the trophic chains in the soil, in the oceans. I think of the DNA. I think of, these things function on their own. They don't need us to control them. We just need to know what they are, understand them, and just let them go. The second one, we're not in charge. I took this picture. I did a little bit of work in Western Australia. Oh, come on up. There's lots of seats up here. Don't knock my coffee over. I don't want to stain the carpet. And the longest fence, you may not have known that the longest fence in the world is in Western Australia. It's called the rabbit-proof fence. So this is an illustration that we're not in charge. The Australians brought rabbits in, I guess, for a food source, right? And then they became pests, and then they built fence after fence after fence to keep them going from Eastern Australia to Western Australia. They built many fences, none of them worked. And the final one is, again, those smallholder farmers. We need to give other people a chance. Let me give you a couple of other examples. Back up to the top of the list. Co-celebrate creativity. Here's a dog sniffing for bed bugs. I've also, seen dogs being used for, sniffing out pests in orchards. And then, a biological approach could be used. I see this as co-creation. Now I've put the DNA double helix, the blue thing, down into we're not in charge. We can use the DNA technology to actually help understand creation, to make good things happen. We do that in our work. We've actually, with colleagues, we've DNA fingerprinted the bacteria in our Glenlee rotation, something that we would have never thought about 20 years ago. But my genetics colleagues also tell me that, you'll never design something perfectly. It won't be stable. And so sometimes there are limits. And then at the bottom, let other people have a chance. We all love chocolate. Most of us, most normal people do. There's a lot of child labor in chocolates, and that's a challenge. So that's a little bit on rest. It's not a perfect analysis. I think any one of us could take those things and sort of think them through, but this is my contribution. And then let's talk a bit about work. We are to work humbly and not enslave others. This is one of the messages in the freeing of the Israelites. We're free from slavery, and we're supposed to practice skilled mastery. And this is an interesting one. The skilled mastery one is this is something that I learned, and I should have known it a long time ago. But it's not subdue and conquer. It's really skilled mastery of the planet. And that's where a lot of my environmental friends go, I don't know how you can be a Christian because that subdue and conquer thing really is pretty ugly. Well, it's not the only interpretation. So when we talk about working humbly and not enslaving others, again, I've got an example out of the chocolate industry, and Carol Off has written a very good book called Bitter Chocolate. Carol Off from CBC, who is actually a Winnipegger. And then at the bottom, I've got skilled mastery. And here is a farmer in southern Manitoba who's changed his dairy farming system to a pasture-based system. And I want to talk a little bit about skilled mastery and grasses. On the right-hand side, you see the picture, and you'll notice the 4 plants, and the one on the right is grazed every day or every other day. You see what happens? There's no roots. And the one on the second to the left, it's got more roots. So is rest a good thing? Yes, resting pastures is a good thing. But should we go all the way to never grazing the pasture? Richard and I, we talked about this yesterday, the work of Alan Savory in southern Africa, in Zimbabwe, and those game parks. And what they did there is they pulled all the animals off the ranges, and they started deteriorating. And that actually made ecological sense, because those areas evolved with grazing, and so they put animals back in, did it in a masterful way, and those areas rehabilitated. You can read that story online. And on the left, the bottom there, you've got a pasture that's, the one on the left is actually grazed. So a couple of other examples of work. I don't pull any punches when it comes to fossil fuels. One thing I know as a scientist is, we just have to stop burning them. That's all there is. Or we have to sequester every kilogram that we burn. That's going to go down hard, but we are enslaving future generations by continuing what we're doing. And I drive an internal combustion vehicle. We're all in this together. But it's something we need to think about, and there is enough renewable energy on the planet to power all the things that we want to power. And then the other example of skilled master I like to show people is the automatic seeder. It's a robotic seeder. Remember I talked about those dead zones? One of the ways of reducing the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico is to plant a cover crop between rows of corn or maize close to maturity, and then when the corn is harvested, the cover crop, like the ryegrass or maybe even a clover, it's going to just retain those nutrients so it doesn't go into the tile drain and off into the Mississippi and off into the Gulf of Mexico. So it's one of these best management practices. But it's pretty hard to seed into standing corn. So people have developed these robotic seeders. They're solar powered, they run down the row. And I like using this as an illustration because it's a technological solution. And so the message of Sabbath doesn't reject technology. Okay, let me switch gears and look at Sabbath a different way. And look at it on the time scale way. Every seventh day, every seventh year, and then 7 times 7, or the Jubilee year, which is every 50th year. That's a description of those are Sabbath rules. I've sort of interpreted them as short-term, medium-term, and long-term. What can we do? What have we learned that would allow us to employ a more Sabbath-based agricultural system? What is the science of Sabbath in those 3 categories? In terms of short-term sort of co-creation phenomena, I think nitrogen fixation is quite exciting. The air that you're breathing, everybody take a breath. 1, 2, 3. Okay, that 78% of what you breathed is nitrogen. Okay, 78% of the atmosphere is nitrogen. And we need nitrogen. Nitrogen becomes protein. Plants do that naturally. Different organisms do that naturally. They do that through bacteria living in the root nodules of this is a soybean plant. And I think it's a marvel that this can happen. And so what we can do in practice is we can improve people's diets tremendously by simply harnessing this very simple natural phenomenon. We have a project in southern Africa, in Zimbabwe, funded by the IDRC, the Canadian government's international research arm. And what we've been asked to do there is to introduce legumes into the conservation agriculture systems that are being promoted by many NGOs, including the Canadian Food Grains Bank, but also the Food and Agriculture Organization of the FAO. And one of the things that these farmers used to do 2 generations ago is intercrop. And some of them have maintained intercropping, but many of them have let the practice go. And our job is to go in there and test and try different types of legumes. This is cowpea in with maize, in these different parts of Zimbabwe. And this woman is very industrious. The rains didn't come to Zimbabwe until last week or about 10 days ago, so they were actually watering their crop. It's very dry there. The advantage of intercropping is that the plants use different parts, different niches. So the maize has its roots in a particular place, and certain legumes like pigeon pea, which has an edible pod and edible seeds and also edible leaves, grows much deeper, and it brings nutrients and even water from down and shares that water with the other crops. It's amazing. This is a co-creation phenomena, in my opinion, and it's one that has been quite ignored for a generation. It has other benefits too. This is a picture that I took a couple of years ago, and here's, they call it sweet bean. It's really just like the French bean, intercropped with maize. And the farmers do not wait until the pods mature before they harvest some of it. They will actually, and some of you may know this, they actually pluck the leaves off and they cook them, and that becomes their relish. They call it the relish. And so that complements the high-starch, maize-based whatever dish, sudza, and there's different names for the maize-based dish in different countries. So there you have your carbs in the background and your protein in the foreground. That protein got there from the atmosphere, diffused into the soil, was captured by bacteria, put into the plant used that nitrogen and put it on the plate. That's amazing. That's a natural phenomenon. We did not figure that out. And in many places in the world, you add the bacteria to the soil, but in ancient agricultural areas like in northwest China, they never add the bacteria. It's in the soil, it's endemic. They've been growing alfalfa there for 3,000 years, and the system has really come into a nice ecological harmony. This is a practice that actually doesn't just live in Africa or in other parts. It also lived in Canada. This is a picture that my brother took for me. This was at the USDA station in Mandan, Bismarck. And what the scientists had done there is they had tried to mimic what the Mandan First Nations would have done for food in the river valleys. And 1,000 years ago, they were growing maize and squash and beans. These are called the Three Sisters. You may have heard of that. And the Three Sisters, the maize, the beans, and either the squash or the pumpkin, you'll find historical evidence of that all the way down into South America. Okay, another sort of short-term phenomena. How many of you have seen this picture before? Not this picture, but this picture, right? You've seen something like it, right? You've been canoeing, you've been water skiing, you've been lost, whatever. Here's a question. How do those evergreens grow on the rock? Yeah. So was there an answer? What's that? Yes, right. Mycorrhiza. That's right. It's actually fungi that allow those plants to grow on those rocks. The fungi called mycorrhiza, they are spores, and when the plant grows, they germinate, they grow into the plant, and they take some energy out of the plant, some carbon, and then they grow their hyphae. Those are those stringy things when you leave the spaghetti sauce in the fridge of 3 weeks too long, it's all over the place. Those things, they go into the rock and they bring the nutrients into the plant. This was discovered in Dresden in 1885, and the plant on the left has been infected, the plant on the right has been infected with mycorrhizal spores, and the one on the left has not. It has a very dramatic influence. And some of you might go to the garden center and buy a mic for your trees, and those are mycorrhizal spores that you're buying. Okay, that's pretty interesting. You didn't nod if you think it's interesting. Okay, I just got to make sure you're awake. Everybody's still, and nobody's nodding. Okay, well then maybe I'll tell a joke. Okay, so this is one of my babies. This is the long-term Glenley crop rotation study, which I started soon after starting at the U of M. And it is a long-term study where we're comparing organic and ecological and conventional farming systems. We've got 3 prairies in there. Those are 1-acre blocks of prairies. And then we have the playground where we can test different things. And then we have we call it euphemistically the Clubhouse Learning Center. It actually has a library, and you can ask Joanne, she'll verify that. So, okay, and one of the things that we've done at Glenley, well, when I say we, it's always me phoning the grad students and asking them if it's already done. But one of the things that Kathy Welch did, she was a very diligent student. She went into the conventional soils and the organic soils, and she separated the mycorrhizal spores. They're actually not called mycorrhizal. They're just the fungal spores that eventually form that association from 100 grams of conventionally managed land and organically managed land. And you can almost get the same thing about conventional till and no-till. So I'm not necessarily valorizing organic here. It's just an example. But in the organic system, we do less. We add less stuff. We just add more plant material. We grow a greater diversity of things, including weeds. And look at the result. There's actually more biological diversity in that 100 grams of soil. So that's interesting. Again, an example of sometimes less is more. Now, the story gets even more interesting, and you're going to be amazed what I'm going to tell you next. Is that in 1996, in USDA Beltsville, Maryland, Sarah Wright and her grad student Christy Nickel, they discovered a sugary substance that contained actually a lot of the carbon in the soil. It's called glomalin or glomalin. It's a glycoprotein, so there's some carbon and some nitrogen, and it binds soil together. So my father in German, he calls it die Gare des Bodens. The tilth of the land. And the way you get the tilth is with this mycorrhiza. It is what binds particles together. And that was only discovered in 1996, the fact that the mycorrhiza produces the glomalin. Farmers have known that for years. But they actually isolated it. And I took this knowledge to North Korea. I was doing some training. And of course, the North Koreans, being technological fundamentalists, they were like, how can we manufacture this stuff in the laboratory? And I said, you can't. You have to grow a plant. And if I would have known how to do it, I would have told them. But it can't be done, at least not yet. So it is estimated that 40% of the soil's carbon is in mycorrhiza. If we're going to sequester carbon to buy us some time to retool our energy system before we cook ourselves on the planet, things like mycorrhiza are very important. And the way we get them sometimes is by just thinking more holistically and allowing things to kind of go along on their own, like in the case of this organic system. One last interesting tidbit is a lot of the sort of applied microbiology that we do in soils now really applies to human medicine. Gut microbiology, there's a lot of papers about it right now. There's all kinds of interesting questions that people are asking about how diverse it needs to be. And we in agriculture, we work with chickens, right? And chickens are monogastrics, and we know that if we feed them just a monoculture diet, they'll have problems right away, and then they need antibiotics. And so there's a lot of coming together here with medical colleagues in terms of trying to understand what is the applied ecology behind this, and then how can we organize our lives and the technologies that we have for a good outcome. And so at our field days, we like to show people these mycorrhiza. So you can't see them with the naked eye, but you can see them with a little microscope. So oftentimes we'll bring out a little generator and we'll have a little light microscope. And Ann Kirk here is showing the mycorrhiza to a visitor to one of our field days. And what farmers are doing about this is, they're realizing that diversity is a good thing. And so the picture on the right is actually of a chickpea flax intercrop. This is on a 4,000-acre no-till farm near Mydale, Saskatchewan, Colin Rosengren's farm. We've been supporting Colin, especially in his early years of intercropping, and you can see that's a no-till field. There's lots of residue on there, and then he's having strips of chickpea and flax. Chickpea is very disease susceptible, and the wind blows the ascochyta spores across the field. By putting the flax with the chickpea, you really block the movement of the pathogen, and it really makes a much better outcome. If you're eating chickpeas, from conventional production, they get a lot of fungicide applications. You're probably wondering, how do you harvest that? Well, you can mechanically harvest that and set your combine and then have a separator later on. And here's a grad student, a former grad student, Haroon, who really did a lot of work on these diverse cropping systems. Okay, so that's, I'm, about a quarter finished now. So the second sort of category of Sabbath, this is really the one that I grew up listening to, the fallow, the regular fallow every 7 years. And my parents in the old country in Germany, they had a 7-year crop rotation. And it was, and my dad assembled those records for me. They're really quite fascinating. The thing that is often considered here is, you've got to fallow the field every 7th year and that's how you have a healthy system. We actually had an experiment at the University of Manitoba, which some fool got rid of in the 1960s. And it's up in the top there, where they were actually looking at all these systems, the different types of fallow and manure and straw burning. It was really exciting for nerds, agronomy nerds. This is like mother's milk. It's like, whoa, straw burning, we can study the effects on carbon. This is very exciting. And where that field is right now, that's where the Investors Group Stadium is. So if somebody intercepts a pass, maybe on the 30-yard line, they're probably right above the sweet clover plot. So I don't know if that affects people's performance on the football field, but there may be some residual karma. I don't, I'm not going to go into this data in any great detail, just to prove to you that there were papers published, this one in 1957, where people looked at, how does management of that fallow actually affect the outcome? And the long and the short of it is that just having it tilled all the time is not good. It does not improve the system. It doesn't add any value. At least in the long term. Skilled mastery in terms of 7-year fallow requires that you grow plants. And that makes sense, right? If the fallow is there for the sojourner and the alien and the animals, you need something for them to consume. Whether they're animals that have 4 legs and walk, whether they're animals that worm their way through the soil. And so we see the type of fallow systems that work well. Up on the top is a plant called lab. And this was a fascinating story of a young African woman who, on her own, decided to try this and grow it with maize. And then she harvested the lab seed, and then she chopped it off, and it regrew, and it makes nitrogen and all those good things. And on the bottom, this is a fallow field on an organic farm where the farmers have planted some peas. The idea of serving the land through skilled mastery and fallow periods is really taking off. Here's an example of a Quebec organic farm that we're working with. This is a picture that I took last summer, and you'll notice they're harvested their winter wheat, but at the bottom in the understory, it's green. And so there's a cover crop growing there to enrich the soil, to feed the sojourner, to feed the alien, to feed the animals, serving the land. Farmers, this whole Sabbath talk is not lost on farmers. I was participating in a soil health conference in Edmonton before Christmas, and there were 400 participants, mostly farmers, organic, conventional, graziers, vegetable farmers, small scale. There was a waiting list of farmers to get in there. It was sold out a long time before the conference was held. And I loved hearing the conversation around the coffee pot. The farmers were excited about building up their soil, and they felt they were really doing something good. And it was heartening. Okay, here's that picture again that I showed you earlier of that fallow. And I'm gonna give you an example of where fallow is not skilled mastery. You may or may not know that in the 1870s in North Dakota, investors came in and bought large tracts of land, 40,000 acres, 70,000 acres, and they farmed these places for about 30 years. And they were called bonanza farms, and the program is on PBS. There were some bonanza farms in Manitoba. Kane, Manitoba was named after Mr. Kane, who had a bonanza farm. They had, this particular picture is from one just outside of Fargo, North Dakota. They fallowed quite a bit, and they really devastated the soil. After 30 years of plowing every X number of years, they had mined out the nutrients and their system collapsed. They had about 25 to 30 consistent wheat crops, and then the system just collapsed. And those 40,000 70-acre farms disappeared. They were economically unstable, and they were replaced by small family farms. So I took a scripture out of Job here. If my land cries out against me, and all its furrows are wet with tears, then let briars come up instead of wheat, and stinkweed instead of barley. It's exactly what happened to the bonanza farms. They were greedy. It's an interesting story, and if you go just south of Fargo, there will be a turnoff on the interstate where you can go visit one of the remnants of the bonanza farm. Okay, what about in the tropics? How do you've heard about fallow in the tropics, and in that area, the slash and burn actually works very well. So this field in front of you here, it was just slashed and burned. It had been in forest for a time, and the farmer will grow 1 or 2 years of crops there and then let it go back to forest, and that'll bring carbon into the soil, enrich it, stimulate lots of biological activity, and after 10 or 15 years, they can slash and burn it again and grow crops. And this was sustainable until the population pressure got so high, or the pineapple corporations kicked them off the lowland, that they needed to rethink their system. So I had the pleasure of working with Don Jose in Honduras. He calls me mi amigo, and he is certainly my friend. He reminds me very much of my late older brother, very similar twinkle. And Don Jose, on the right, you can see the green stuff. He had gotten around this fallow problem by growing different green manure cover crops. This is Mucuna bean. And so farmers are very resourceful in mimicking that fallow system. So the Sabbath is alive, it's changing, it's evolving to whatever people need. And Don Jose is making it work on his farm. And so are other farmers around the world. I had the opportunity to travel with Roland Bunch, who's the fellow with the green hat. He has done development work in smallholder agriculture for a long time. He's a real rock star in that world, so I was really excited to be able to spend a week with him. And here he's talking to some farmers in Kenya about different species of these legumes. There's a species of legume for every soil circumstance in the world, except maybe the bottom of the ocean. But this is one of the real exciting things about thinking more ecologically is it forces you to think more about all the diversity that's out there. And where did the diversity come from? Good question. The whole idea of empowering farmers through knowledge is something that is really front and center. Vandana Shiva, P. Sainath, these are people who've advocated for this for a long, long time. And even pineapples can be grown ecologically. The problem when I, talked about disparagingly about the pineapple corporation, the problem is not the pineapple. Pineapple is great. It'll grow in the hillsides. And you could do ecological pineapple production. And here, people were doing that, intercropping it with a whole range of crops, including coffee. Okay. Let's jump ahead to the Jubilee year. What do we know about, that? What can we conceptualize as scientists that would possibly be of any interest to somebody thinking about the whole notion of Jubilee, which, is the idea that you would, if you owned that land 50 years ago, you get it back, right? You redistribute all the wealth again. That's a real challenge. My pension funds at the University of Manitoba are doing well simply because we're not following the Jubilee year. And if we follow the Jubilee year, my pension earnings, Bruno and my pension earnings will not be very good. So, we have a lot to think about. I'm going to give you two sort of quick illustrations of wisdom that I think would help inform us about, as technologists. The first comes from E.F. Schumacher. He wrote the book, Small is Beautiful. I read this book in the fourth year university, and I thought it was written, I liked the book. I thought it was written by a hippie. And later I learned, I should have read the cover, but it was written by an industrialist who was the chief economist for the British Coal Board for 27 years. I mean, this person, got dressed up to go to work. He had a lot of insights, probably because of his experience as an industrialist. He said that the exclusion of wisdom from economics, science, and technology is something we could get away with as long as we were relatively unsuccessful. Okay, so what I take that to mean is, let's say I have a plot of land, and you have a plot of land, and you have a plot of land, and it's, there's sort of a jade with trees between, and I mess up my plot of land. Well, it's not going to wreck the whole region, right? But now that we have become very successful, and we are successful, right? Remember, how much photosynthesis do we procure? 40%. We're very successful. Now that we have become very successful, the problem of spiritual and moral tradition moves into the central position. This is, when I was 20, whatever, reading this, I didn't understand it. I liked the examples, but I didn't understand the philosophy. But now I understand it a little bit better. He went on to say that nothing makes economic sense unless its permanence can be projected over a long period of time without running into absurdities. So, I'll just let that soak. I think we know what permanence means. I think it's the absurdities part that we can fill in the blanks as we go away from here. There's another group of writers and thinkers who also have something to say about Jubilee. And some of them are very controversial. Naomi Klein says, capitalism has to go. Even agronomists, contested agronomy, agronomists are starting to question, how did the neoliberal economic era really influence how we thought and how we were taught and how we teach? And P. Sainath has the best bits to say about this, perhaps because he works in India. And he calls himself a rural reporter, but he's a real whiz kid. He's brilliant. And he has many lectures on YouTube. You'd probably appreciate them. But all of these people, they call into question the social, political, and economic status quo. So people are thinking about Jubilee. Agrarian writers are thinking about Jubilee. Now I want to end with, what can we do on the ground? What can we do as practical scientists? Is it possible to return to a more natural state? Is this dreaming or is this reality? If we look at the prairies, this is a picture that my late friend Guy Lafon took near Indian Head. And when you think about that landscape, what was there before was, buffalo and prairie and maybe not quite as many trees because they had more prairie fire and First Nations and that type of thing. Well, we took a shot at it. Con Campbell was a scientist in Swift Current at Ag Canada, and when I was a graduate student in Saskatchewan, he also had a big influence on me. And I love history and I love the long-term studies, and I knew I wanted to start my own. And we talked about whether we should put a prairie restoration into the study, and I did, thank goodness. I did it because Ducks Unlimited was starting this program where they would pay farmers to take land out of production for either 10 or 21 years, and they would pay them during that time period. And the motivation for Ducks Unlimited to do that is because the duck population was going down in the 80s, and there wasn't enough upland nesting habitat for the waterfowl. I didn't realize this, that they didn't do all their business in the water. They actually have their nests in the upland, but I wasn't paying attention. So I established 3 one-acre blocks of this, and this one happens to be named after Grant McEwen, who was the former dean of our faculty. He was also the mayor of Calgary and the lieutenant governor of Alberta, and he loved prairies and wrote about it, and his books are in our library in the Clubhouse Learning Center. It's just wonderful to have this prairie. In about the 18th year of the study is now going into its 25th year. Lindsay Bell, a scientist from Australia, came to spend 3 months with us, and he was interested in the carbon stocks in these various rotations. So he cored down to 1.2 meters, okay? And
and looked at how much carbon, how many tons of carbon were in the soil. And you can see the data there, and it's published. The grain farming and even the mixed farming had about 40 tons per carbon in the top 1.2 meters. But the prairie, after 18 years, had almost 3 times that much, 114 tons of carbon per hectare. That amount of carbon sequestration will buy us 60 years in climate change adaptation. No problem. Right now we're working with Ratan Lal and his group at Ohio State University, and Ratan Lal, L-A-L, if you Google that word, he has actually got many global projects on carbon sequestration for climate change mitigation. So, at the same time that we started, I started this in 1992 when I had absolutely no gray hair, we fell into relationship with the Land Institute, which is Wes Jackson's shop. And here is actually a picture of Jerry Glover looking, the Land Institute is also interested in perennial plants, and their crazy idea was to breed perennial wheat and perennial flax and perennial sunflower and perennial sorghum so that you wouldn't have to plow up the land every year and you'd get a seed harvest and you'd be able to put a lot of carbon in the soil. They've been at it for a long time, probably 40 years, Joanne? And so this is Jerry Glover. He's got the prairie plants on the left, the wheat on the right. You see the roots on the left, they're deeper than the wheat, they're not too hard to see. We've done this kind of work as not with grasses, but it's really fun. Well, if it works, it's really fun work. So we knew that these prairie grasses have these deep roots, put a lot of carbon in. They would really help deal with climate change because they would sequester carbon. And for farmers like in the Interlake of Manitoba who, where it rains a lot, they can't get onto seed, wouldn't it be nice to have a grass that wasn't connected to grazing exclusively, that they could thresh and actually harvest and make some flatbread out of? So that's actually what we're doing at the University of Manitoba, and we're really excited about that. The picture on the top left is a colleague, Doug Catani, who's our perennial grain breeder, who we hired a few years ago. That's his nursery. On the bottom left is actually the combine at Kansas harvesting their kernza. And the way we handle it is we thresh the grain and then we use the aftermath for grazing. So we can't get high enough yields yet on the grain to make it economically attractive just with grain. We have to do the dual purpose system. But you have to start somewhere, and remember Wes's words. If you're working on a problem that you'll solve in your lifetime, you're not thinking big enough. I'm just going to end with this thought. What can young people do? What do you tell your nieces and nephews, and what do you tell yourself if you're just starting out? What can you do? So what can we do? Well, we can educate differently. We have had an agroecology program in our faculty for about 15 years, and it's been terrific. We've trained the students in all the standard disciplines, but they look at everything through the lens of agroecology. I'm really pleased that CMU is starting an environmental studies program because there's a tremendous need for people who have that broader vision. And then on the right-hand side, there's the suburbs. Everybody likes to make fun of the suburbs. I live in the suburbs. There's not a lot of choices when you want to buy a house. There's some, but most of the last 40 years, we've been offered suburbs as places to live. But the nice thing about suburbs is they have a lot of land. And the landscape architects and the agronomists have now starting designing models for how those suburban neighborhoods can actually be turned into urban agriculture. We're not going to throw the people out of their houses, but there's all kinds of interesting things. And I really like that notion because it allows people to kind of get involved with land right where they are. You don't need a big patch of land to really learn about the value of Sabbath in creation care and creation tending. Wendell Berry says, the one really useful thing about gardening is that it teaches you limits. And it's so true. How many of you have gardened and had a crop failure? Yeah, thanks. Anybody? I had to, okay, so one person. Okay. Oh, I'm really shocked. How did it happen? Yeah, of course, there's many back there, right? You plant a garden, then it floods, and then, you need more diversity. And I think, I don't want to make everybody a gardener. You don't have to be a gardener. You can just buy from a local gardener, but maybe have a conversation with them. And they'll say, well, I got no cucumbers this year because, these mites came and ate it, or it flooded, or whatever, or the seed was bad, it didn't germinate. So would you take zucchini? And you say, well, I don't really want zucchini, but okay. So you're learning limits as well. And I think Wendell Berry was pretty smart because Sabbath is about restraint, and it's about showing respect. And I think being involved with matter helps you do that. So I think the urban agriculture movement is really good, making peace with the land where we live. And of course, there's all kinds of interesting climate adaptation options. And cities, in 100 years, cities will be generating all their energy, and they're going to be recycling all their nutrients. So let's just get there faster so that we we don't cause any more problems. So thank you very much for listening to my fairly awkward linkage between science and Sabbath, but it is a work in progress, and I really appreciate your patience. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Martin for a very engaging presentation. Now I would like to open up the floor to questions. So if you do have a question, you may come up to the microphone right there. And I believe there's another one moving around somewhere as well.
Hi. Just an observation, when I hear them talk about pollution in Lake Winnipeg, they always use the word nutrients, and it drives me crazy because it sounds like a euphemism. But when you use it in relation to water, it just sounds like something that's been squandered and is in the wrong place. But I still don't like it when I hear it in the news. That word really does sound like a euphemism.
What word is that? Sorry.
Nutrients.
Oh, you don't like the word nutrient?
When they use it in terms of pollution in Lake Winnipeg.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But when you use it, it sounds like you're complaining about something that's being squandered
Yes.
and put in the wrong place.
Yes.
Which is true in Lake Winnipeg too, possibly.
It's really great that you raise that. The Lake Winnipeg issue is a close to home issue, and the sources of nutrient pollution in Lake Winnipeg are many. It's complicated. There's a whole bunch of different sources: agriculture, cities, the stuff coming in from the U.S., stuff coming in from the prairie provinces because we're a massive drainage basin. But it's so disheartening to hear of things like phosphorus, which is a valuable element in food production, be sort of talked about negatively. Yeah. Well, the perspective that we have on the elements that we work with are all different, right? Some people, if you're working at the sewage plant, you see it as the enemy. If you're a hog farmer and you're spreading it on your land and you're saying, wow, I just saved myself $80 an acre in fertilizer, you're very happy. But what we need to strive to do is to recycle those nutrients. We sort of mine them, transport them to where we grow our crops. We use them once and then we throw them away. And one thing I've learned about agriculture in Asia, for example, is that there's a real emphasis on recycling. Of course, the night soil phenomena in China, which still happens in some places, and in North Korea, where I've worked, they collect everything and put it back on the land because they have very difficult time getting fertilizer. But in 100 years, and hopefully sooner, if the engineers can just implement what we already know, it can be done very simply. It doesn't even have to take diesel fuel to run it. You can use biological filters. In Calcutta, they're using biological filters because they can't afford the fancy stuff. Yeah, weeds, sedges, things like that.
So I had lunch with a guy called Martin Entz this week, And he's like the Billy Graham of organic farming, and he makes me almost convinced to go into organic farming with my small farm that I farm with my son. And when I convey this to my son, he says, "But Dad, there's an ethical problem there, isn't there? Because someplace we read in Reader's Digest or something that 60% of humanity now relies on artificially produced fertilizers for the nutrients, that if we go totally to organics, 60% of us have to voluntarily leave this planet." Is that true?
Well, let me first of all see if we can rustle up 60% here. Yeah. Well, it's actually there is some truth to that. Nitrogen fertilizer through the Haber-Bosch process is responsible for providing protein sources to many people and providing the nitrogen to grow crops. Is there an alternative? This is something that we talk about all the time, and there are studies that show that, the question is, can organic feed the world? And the answer is, we're not even there yet. That's not really a legitimate question in terms of the type of agriculture we practice here in North America. Because if we're going to talk about risks and inefficiencies, we don't have to look very far. I mean, in North America, our agriculture really supports meat production. We're grain farmers, but everybody's basically feeding animals that don't need the corn. But if we look at the smallholders around the world, I think that's where that question really becomes critical. And I have to say that a little bit of nitrogen fertilizer goes a long way on those smallholder farms. For example, in that conservation agriculture example, even if you're adding some legumes to that field, in that planting station where the corn is growing, if you put some manure in there and you add they add just like a 7-Up cup full of nitrogen on there, that actually makes quite a bit of difference because it primes that system. It gives the bacteria something to eat to actually decompose the manure. And so there's all kinds of reasonable ways of thinking about technology like fertilizer. But I'm not surprised at your son's answer. I've heard that question many times. And if anybody else in my lab would like to take a stab at that, at answering that question, you're welcome to it. It's been a long day. But the Vaclav Smil is a U of M scholar. He's a nitrogen scholar. He's very famous. He's consulted with Al Gore, and he has done the math on this. And his argument is that unless we are going to change our diets, we're going to have to use a nitrogen fertilizer. Our diets right now are very heavy meat-based, and that's the wiggle room right there. We waste about 40% of our food. So, that's a good point Sasha is making. I know we had a conversation last week. I know your son is named Sasha. But if you look at it holistically, there's places where we could really cut back on nitrogen fertilizer, which includes much of Canada. And there's places in the world where, we have to be very careful not to, recolonize with organic ideas the way we did with maize and other things in developing countries.
What did you mean by sequestering the excess carbon? I don't think I quite understood that or understood what you meant by that. And I think I understood that we have excess carbon in the air, we want to get rid of it, and you said sequestered in the ground. How can that be done, or what does that mean?
Yeah, let me just call up the slide here. Yeah, this is the slide that I was referring to, where I may have used that word. Sequestering really means, how can you get, let me do a better job of it. Hang on. Okay, sequestering really, we all know what sequester means, right? It means bring it into the medium of the soil. I think, who's the rich guy in the UK who flew to the moon or is building a spaceship or whatever? Forget that person's name. Yeah, right. He had a big prize. He's going to give somebody like $10 million if they can figure out a magical way to bring carbon out of the atmosphere and sequester it. So we had a think tank meeting at Gary Martin's place in Kleefeld in the fall, and we were going to send Branson a seed just a seed, and we were waiting for the 10 million bucks in the mail, because that's the only way to do it is through plant growth. So sequestering carbon means bringing some of that atmospheric carbon into the soil, and that is done with plant growth. And the deeper the plants can place the carbon, the better, and it's more stable. The carbon does cycle, and last year's science in residence scholar Henry Jansen, I mean, he's a carbon scholar of, he's world renowned. But does that answer your question? So you use plants, and then the carbon goes into the soil, and you need plants all the time to keep it there and to keep it efficiently stored. And you can build up the carbon in the soil from, let's say, 4% carbon to 6% carbon over quite a span of time, but you can increase the carbon. And that means a lot of, so if you buy a carbon offset, most of us in wealthy nations, we really should be buying carbon offsets when we do airplane travel. We do in our program. And so, you can calculate how much CO2, how much carbon that fossil fuel burning costs you, and you can invest in some tree planting program or in some other program to sequester carbon and offset that.
Martin, a couple of times you've said that we're going to have to do this, or this will happen, and you've sort of spread a lot of ideas out. How do we apply fertilizer to that process? How do we make it go faster in terms of changing policy? Like your talk here tonight is one attempt to inform the public about these things, and it's going to trickle down somehow and maybe speed that process. Can you talk a little bit more about some of the key ways you think that process could be sped up? And now I'm, in a sense, not your agronomist hat, but your public policy hat.
Okay. So you all heard that question. That's a great question. Thinking of carbon, I think that you have to put a cap on carbon. You have to cap it. I was going to talk about Jevons paradox, but I didn't think I had time. But Stanley, let me just tell the story, start there. Stanley Jevons wrote that, he was one of my mentors, wrote the book, The Coal Question, and it was published in 1865, and he was observing that as the steam engine was becoming more efficient during the time in Britain, instead of going down, coal consumption was actually going up. And how was that possible? What's the logic there? Well, the efficiency of the steam engine was freeing up capital, and that capital was going hunting for more carbon to burn. I mean, the miracle of our economic growth over the last 200 years is mostly about burning carbon. That's how this thing works. And that's why it's so difficult to talk about restraining ourselves on carbon. But I think putting a cap on carbon, either by a carbon tax, and a hefty one, or actually just putting a carbon a cap. Every family gets 100 tons of carbon a year. That's it. You figure out how you want to burn it. And then it has to be a sliding scale. The next year you get 95, and then you get 90. It's the only way it's going to work. And people look at me and they say, yeah, you're an academic. But you know what? We got rid of slavery. We got rid of the slavery the way we knew it 100 years ago. And that's the same fight that this is. Instead of trying to efficiency our way out of it, instead of trying to human cleverness our way out of it, which is where most of the research dollars are going, we just have to put a cap on it. And then let's see what the technology looks like. And secondly, just very quickly, the provincial government, for the first time ever, has invited me to come and give them some policy advice. Because they so, that's great. I think that'll be exciting. But, the love is pretty tough. But people can, John, people can adapt pretty quickly. Look at the Syrian refugee crisis. Everybody said, it can't be done, can't do this. I think it woke Canadians up, right? We were all thinking, this is never going to happen. And now it's actually not only happening, but it's actually good for us as a country to work together as neighbors and help each other. And, I get a call, can you give this, and sponsor this? And you get people, community groups who now have never done this, and they need to get in touch with churches or other faith groups who have the experience. This is a good thing. Capping carbon will have the same result. It'll build community.
I'm John Peters, and I'll declare my age by saying that I can remember the argument at the university when those long-term plots were turned into sports fields and whatever. And I guess the academics lost on that argument. But
thank you for that, John.
You have shown us some slides about perennial cereals. Now, and you also indicated that you should try to address problems that you know you won't be able to solve because you'll be gone by the time the solution is there. So can you imagine what leguminous perennial wheat might turn out to be in terms of solving nitrogen problems and erosion problems and whatever?
Great. I love your dream. I'm right behind you. Thank you for that question. What I didn't say in our research is that the perennial wheat plots that are growing out in Carman, Manitoba right now, they are undersown to different legumes. So that's as far as we've taken that system. We've sown either white clover or sweet clover or alfalfa with them to feed that nitrogen into that system. To make wheat nitrogen fixing is a dream that's been around for a long time. I'm quite skeptical because the physiology of the wheat plant is not really organized well to do that, but I think we should keep trying. One of our colleagues worked on it, Kevin Vesey worked on it for about 10 years, and many other people have. One interesting anecdote along that line, though, is if you're going to have wheat that has that association with the bacteria, like I described, the wheat has to, sort of fall in love with that bacteria. They have to have a relationship. And Bix Biederbeck, hilarious guy, was a soil scientist in Swift Current at Ag Canada for many years. And he had a crop rotation that was lentil wheat, and then continuous wheat, and then fallow wheat, and all the usual suspects. And there was a paper out of Egypt where the Egyptians had noticed bacteria infecting the roots of wheat when the wheat was grown in a rotation with berseem clover, which is also called Egyptian clover, which is very popular. So Bix, being the entrepreneurial young Bavarian lad, he jumped out to his plots and he took soil samples and he found exactly the same thing in Swift Current. Where the wheat had been associated with the legume regularly, it did have those endophytic rhizobial associations, and where the wheat had not been in that association, didn't have them. So he got sort of halfway there. So that's all I have, I live in hope. The other thing we can do is turn it around and make a legume into a cereal, which I think is actually a lot easier. So, but they're both great goals. I don't want to stop eating wheat, and my friend Hardy certainly doesn't want to stop eating wheat. So if I say that, I'm going to get a chair thrown at me because we love our wheat. We could eat less wheat. We could eat a more diversified diet. We could eat some barley. We could eat some pulses. We could. Let me throw one thing at you which I didn't really have a chance to say, and I just want to maybe when we consider going to a perennial-based agriculture, we're not going to get rid of the animals. Many of you have heard of grass-fed animal products, and one thing we know is that ruminant animals like sheep and beef animals and dairy animals, they evolved not eating grain, but just eating grass. And if you look here at this, many studies show that the fatty acid profile, the good cholesterol versus bad cholesterol, is much healthier in animals that only ever eat grass. And so this is our secret weapon. When we talk to the provincial government policy people, we say, you know what? Don't worry so much about all this perennial plant material that's going to be in the landscape, because we will consume it with livestock. We're going to stop feeding the livestock grain or as much grain. We're going to do that. And here is really the slide I want to show. There are a number of beef breeders in Canada and the United States and in the UK and in other countries of the world who are actually selecting animals that actually finish on grass. And this is, again, a miracle of creation. There's so much diversity out there, you just have to select what you're looking for. And so now, with associations between the Irish and the Americans and the Canadians, animal scientists have a pretty good idea of what genetics grass-finishing animals need to have. And that Angus cow there on the right, big rumen, short little front legs, those are some of the signals that that is an animal that can finish on grass. So it would give you a nice marbled steak only on grass. And this is, in my opinion, this is a revolution. This is revolutionary. And I think that has to be put along the discussion about nitrogen being required to feed the 30% or 40%. So we can each at least have a full discussion. And these two farmers, these are two diploma grads from our faculty, Stefan and Jonathan Bao. I think they're both about 7.5 feet tall. So they're a little intimidating, but luckily they like me. And I had a group of students, I like to have them talk to students about this, and I think it's a very exciting development. And it shows the entrepreneurial opportunities that are connected with this ecological agricultural model.
Okay, let's thank Martin one more time.